The VapePassion Show, episode 33. Hey guys, welcome back to the show. I'm recording this on Saturday, September 10th. I don't have a whole lot of updates for you, but something I've been thinking about doing is splitting up my vlogs into smaller videos so that each section of the vlog is easier to find and watch for any of you out there who don't want to watch the full vlogs. I'm going to try this out for this show, and I'll see how it goes from there. I'll still publish the full vlogs as one video for anyone who wants to watch everything at once, and nothing will change with the podcast. So just wanted to give you a heads up on that. So the first thing I want to talk about this week is, I realized that I've never really explained my story, my vape story. So I was a smoker ever since I was about 13 years old, and I quit by using electronic cigarettes back in 2010. So something a lot of you might not know about me is that I'm very passionate about health and fitness for about 10 years now. And I've owned a health and fitness website for about 8 years now, which is mixedfitness.com, if any of you are wondering. I used to publish a blog post on it at least once per week, and I've done that for many years. And when I started to focus more on my vaping website, VapePassion.com, that's when I kind of started to neglect that website. So I rarely blog on it anymore, but health and fitness is still something I'm very passionate about. But anyway, it was my passion for health that drove me to quitting smoking back in 2010 by using an electronic cigarette. I quit smoking 3 months after buying that e-cig, and I also quit vaping. And it was also my passion for health that brought me back to vaping 5 years later in 2015. So let me explain a little bit about that. So one of the areas of health that I've been really interested in over the years is biohacking. If you look up the definition of biohacking, it's defined as the activity of exploiting genetic material experimentally without regard to ethical standards, or basically improving physical performance, increasing longevity, and improving mental health through experimentation. One example of that would be taking supplements called nootropics, such as piracetam or aniracetam, which are used for cognitive enhancement, or taking a strong prescription drug like modafinil. Modafinil is designed for narcolepsy patients, but people use it to get effects that are similar to Adderall, such as extreme focus, alertness, and energy. I've experimented with all of these things and more, but the point of biohacking is to improve yourself in a healthy and positive way, not a dangerous way. So obviously not doing things like steroids. Some examples that you might be more familiar with would be something like drinking coffee for the benefits of caffeine, or using something like a Fitbit to record data about yourself and continuously working towards improving your health. So in late 2014, the biohacking community started talking a lot about using nicotine as a nootropic to enhance brain function. Since I had an old e-cig laying around, I decided to try it out. But the battery was dead after sitting for 5 years, so I ordered a new one, and that was the iStick 20 watt with the Nautilus mini tank. You'll see a review for that up on my YouTube channel if you want to check it out. And I loved the benefits that nicotine had on my attention span, focus, and alertness, so I stuck with it. I also still had that strong passion of promoting electronic cigarettes as a way to quitting smoking. In those past 5 years, even though I had no longer vaped, I was still telling people, smokers that I knew, how I quit and telling them that e-cigarettes are a good way to do it, at least because it worked for me. So anyway, I ran a website for about 3 years after quitting smoking, and it was heavily focused on quitting smoking cigarettes and the dangers of smoking. I also talked a lot about the various ways to quit smoking using any form of cessation, but my focus was on electronic cigarettes. So with those two things, along with my love for tech gadgets, that's what really turned vaping into a hobby for me. So now here I am doing a vaping podcast. I do vape reviews. I do vape blogs. So yeah, vaping has really become a huge part of my life, and that's my story. All right, so let's get into some of the topics this week. First, I want to talk about some science and research stuff. So this first one I want to talk about was on vapingpost.com. They talked about a study in Scotland. This one is supposedly the first study to be carried out about vaping during pregnancy. The reason I say supposedly is because I know that there was someone that was supposed to be doing a study soon on the same exact subject. And I tried to find it in my notes on my website because I thought I might have talked about it in a previous episode, and I guess I didn't because I didn't find anything. But I know someone was going to do a study. But it wasn't going to happen until next year. It might actually be the same study. I don't know. But anyway, So this one is being put on by the UK Centre for Tobacco and Alcohol Studies, and that is a network of 13 universities. They will be recruiting several hundred women for this study, and it will be carried out next year in 2017. The researchers plan to monitor whether vaping can aid smoking pregnant women who are struggling to quit smoking. Their babies are also going to be monitored and assessed up until the age of 2 to determine whether these children were exposed to any harm and how vaping might have affected their development. Linda Bald, who is the professor of health policy at the University of Stirling and deputy director of the UK Centre for Tobacco and Alcohol Studies, has said that there has not been enough effort to aid certain adult groups, such as prisoners and pregnant women, to quit smoking. And this is the first trial of its kind. Linda Bald also mentioned that nicotine replacement therapies, or NRTs, are routinely given to pregnant women, and the same will be happening in this study. Several hundreds of pregnant women will be given NRTs, and some of them will be electronic cigarettes, and this is all going to be randomly. The researchers will then assess which is the most effective at helping them quit, the method's safety, and which method of NRT those subjects prefer. So really cool study, and I can't wait to see the results of that one. And then another study I came across was one from British American Tobacco and MatTech Corporation. So they did a combination of tests to investigate the potential adverse effects of e-cigarette vapor on airway tissue compared with cigarette smoke. So they say that until now, there have been no aerosol studies of potential adverse effects on e-cigarette vapor on in vitro models, so that would be like test tubes, that so closely mimic the structure, function, and exposure of normal human airway tissue. In this study, they used 2 commercially available e-cigarettes on human airway tissue, and the results show that cigarette smoke reduces cell viability to 12%, which is near complete cell death, after 6 hours. But neither of the e-cigarette aerosols showed any significant decrease in cell viability. So despite 6 hours of continuous exposure, the results were similar to those of control cells exposed to only air. So it looks like aerosol exposure from vaping really has no adverse effects on airway tissue. So that's some good news. And now I want to talk a little bit about this. This isn't necessarily a study, but this is some research-related stuff. Like I mentioned earlier in the show, about how I got into vaping, I had a passion for health and fitness for a long time, and one of the people that I've really admired over the years is Chris Kresser. This guy's an expert in functional medicine and paleo or ancestral nutrition. His focus is on alternative health based on scientific evidence. This is the kind of stuff that's curing people from diseases that traditional health experts say can't be cured. Some of you guys listening probably think I'm crazy, but it's something I do believe in. I highly recommend listening to Chris Kresser's podcast and reading the stuff that he publishes on his website. But anyway, he was on the Joe Rogan podcast last week, and he talked about a lot of great stuff. If you want an hour and a half of eye-opening information about health and nutrition, go have a listen. But one of the parts that really caught my attention was a discussion about the corruption of the pharmaceutical industry. So this is about 45 minutes into the video. You'll find that on YouTube. But he talks about how there are some real problems with how science is conducted today. And they also talked about things like who's funding some of these drug trials on pharmaceutical drugs, the efficacy of those trials, and how these companies are profiting from it. So Chris Kresser, he mentions that 2/3 of medical research is funded by Big Pharma. He quoted Upton Sinclair, who said, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it," which explains a lot about the results of many studies we see in or out of the vaping industry. He also says that it's just basic human nature. Even if it's not conscious, it's subconscious. So if you're a researcher being funded by a pharmaceutical company and you know that your results are negative and don't support that drug that you're doing the test on, you're less likely to get your next project funded. So that could have something to do with the way study results come out. Chris Kresser, he does mention that most researchers, or he believes that most researchers are good people trying to do the right thing, but it's just the way that the system is set up that creates these problems. Because these researchers, they need to depend on pharmaceutical companies for their funding. And that can really end up skewing the results of a study. Something else he mentioned, which I never knew about, was that up until just recently, pharmaceutical companies were not required to publish negative results. So if it turned out that a placebo was more effective, or that the drug had side effects that made it not usable, that data didn't have to be published in the study results. From what I understand, from what Chris Kresser said, that has been changed recently, but that doesn't change anything from the studies that have been published in the past. So a lot of the studies that we know about now that researchers are still using might be missing pretty crucial data. He also mentioned fraud. So one of the examples he gives was that there was a study published in the Journal of American Medical Association. A guy named Charles Seifert looked at the FDA monitoring of drug trials. One of the jobs of the FDA is to make sure that drug trials are done the way that they should be done, which means making sure that no patient data is falsified, things like that. So what Charles Seifert found was that in 96% of cases where the FDA found fraud, the action of fraud that those researchers acted in was not reported in the study results. And another case he gives here, researchers changed patient data to hide the fact that the patient had prior liver and kidney problems, and they gave this guy chemotherapy treatment and he died. The researcher spent 6 years in jail, and this was never mentioned in the study that was published. So one really good example of how this can really be dangerous is an example that Chris Kresser gave. He mentioned that there was a trial for an anticoagulant drug, and the FDA found that the testing center falsified patient data and change the results. Well, because the FDA didn't require that this data was taken out of the study results, it was included in the final study. If this false data was taken out of that study, that drug would have failed and would not have been more effective than a placebo. But since the FDA didn't require that data be taken out, it was published with it, and studies that came out even 18 months later or longer have been using this study with that falsified data in their own studies. And these research teams that are using this original study as the basis for their study have no idea that the data is not true or accurate. And doctors all over the world are using the results of this original study and the other studies using that same data to make decisions on whether or not to prescribe these drugs to their patients. So very, very dangerous stuff. And then he talks a little bit about the peer review process. So here's another example he gave. There was a big study where a paper was submitted to the British Medical Journal, which is a major medical journal. And the study that was submitted had 8 major errors. They knew that it had 8 major errors. Not a single scientist of the 221 scientists who peer-reviewed that paper found all of the errors. Only 30% of them recommended rejecting the paper, and half of them were warned in advance that the paper would have all of these errors. And even those scientists who were warned about these errors, they didn't find any more errors than the guys who didn't know about the errors. So peer review is a major part of the scientific method, and it's not working. And that could mean that in a lot of cases, a lot of the findings that we take to be true and valid are not actually true and valid. And here's another example of something wrong with the system. The Open Science Collaboration, they did a review of 100 psychology studies that have never been validated and tried to replicate them, and they could only actually replicate 35% of them. The other ones in exact same or as closely similar situations as possible to the original study, they couldn't do it. And it has actually been found to be happening in a lot of studies where they're not actually being validated. And in Chris Kresser's words, he says, whole fields of research is built on studies that can't be replicated. And then another thing he talked about was that another issue that many studies have are that they're not performed long enough. So there have been many studies that showed positive results over 2 weeks, for example, but that's not applicable to the way we live our life. If you perform a study over months, years, or even decades, you see whatever has been shown to be positive in the short term ends up being negative in the long term. This doesn't necessarily happen for dishonest reasons. A lot of times it's simply because studies are extremely expensive and become much more expensive and more difficult to control the longer the study is. So yeah, basically there's just a lot of problems with how studies are being done. Studies are important and many are done well, but a lot of these issues just shows that you need to be cautious about all of the scientific research that you read, good or bad. And the reason I bring this up is because there is so much research coming out in regards to vaping, and I just think it's important for everyone to keep a lot of these things in mind. Alright, now I want to talk a little bit about some recent news. So Samsung just recalled the Galaxy Note 7 phones due to exploding batteries. On September 2nd, they launched a global recall of the Galaxy Note 7, which is their newest smartphone, after reports and pictures surfaced showing a melted handset, a melted phone. And then following Samsung's recall, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, advised passengers not to turn on or charge the Samsung phones while on board an airplane. They don't want them to be stowed in checked baggage either, but they haven't banned them completely, at least not yet. So the reason I bring this up is just because electronic cigarettes get so much hate because of these random battery explosions, which are happening much less than the media makes it seem. But batteries and laptops, which use lithium-ion batteries, they have problems too. And the reason you don't hear about them very often is just because it's not a big popular topic to talk about. And the reason that we're hearing about this one now with Samsung is simply because they had a global recall, which doesn't usually happen, at least not with smartphones and laptops. But yeah, it's just a thing with batteries. It doesn't matter what kind of device you're using it in. All right, and now while we're on the topic of batteries, I saw this post on vapingunderground.com, and this guy is asking the community if he messed up by separating his married batteries and using them in another mod, in a single battery mod. And there were some good comments here. Things like, it's fine to use them again, but you just need to charge them up together and use them together. The big issue really is that they have similar discharge and charging life cycles, very closely anyway. The reason why you use married batteries is because if you use an older battery and a newer battery, the older battery is not going to have the same kind of life that the new battery does. It might die faster, and it might not be able to hold a charge as long. And if you're using that in a device, the old battery is going to run out of energy a lot faster, and you could go below safe voltage of that battery. You could kill it, or maybe it could vent, cause a dangerous situation with your device. And your device might not be able to catch that because it's going to be counting the combined voltage, how much energy you have combined in those batteries. It might not be able to see that old battery is dead, and then the full battery, the new battery, has a lot more life in it. And that's why you use married batteries. I also did some research on married batteries, and I wanted to mention some things about that. So these batteries should always be kept together as much as possible, and they need to be the same brand and same specs. You don't want to mix and match different batteries, even if they're both new. So let's say you buy two different brands of batteries. They're both 2500 milliamp hours. They're both 20 amp batteries. You can't use them together because even though their amp and milliamp hour ratings are the same, the internal chemistry is different. So you should never mix them together. Not two different brands. So some people have the misconception that you can only use those same two married batteries in the same mod forever. You can't use them in another mod. That's not true. You can use them in another mod as long as those batteries stay together. You don't want to separate them. So if you're, say for example, you're using two married batteries in an iStick 100, you can move those batteries to another device as long as it's a dual battery device. It's fine to move batteries back and forth as long as they're not separated and discharged unevenly. You could even use one of your batteries, say for example you have a dual battery device, you could actually use those batteries separately in single battery devices as long as they're discharged the same. So you could use one in a single battery device, discharge it, and then use the other one and discharge it, and then it'll have the same discharge cycle, and then recharge them again together, or separately. It doesn't really matter, as long as they have the same charging and discharging cycles. Theoretically, that's safe, but Mooch, he does recommend that you do charge and use them together because it does prevent other variations from being tried, and some of which could potentially lead to problems. Something else that I've seen people talking about is that in some mods, one battery is drained faster than the other. Mooch actually responded to a question like this on a thread that I was reading, and he says that this doesn't sound right to him because it just doesn't make sense that one battery would get stressed more. He says that there's no electrical explanation except that any two batteries will discharge differently because no two are alike from the factory. Their position in the mod doesn't determine that. They're both supplying exactly the same amount of current. And I've heard people mention that before. It sounds like it could be something that kind of sticks around from back in the days when people used to use stacked batteries, but there doesn't seem to be any real scientific explanation for that one. So that could just be a myth. Another question you might have with married batteries is if it's okay to charge them separately. So say for example you have two batteries and you only have a 1-bay charger. It's totally fine. You can charge one battery at a time as long as they both go through the same charging cycles. You don't want to keep using one of those batteries over and over before charging up the other one. So hopefully that answers some of your questions about married batteries. All right, now let's get into some tips and tricks stuff. So the first one I want to talk about here is a thread on e-cigarette forum. This one is about drip tips. This guy asks if different drip tips affect things like flavor, throat hit, or heat of the tip. There are a lot of answers here, and I agree with a lot of them. So this person, Grimwald, he has a list here. He says a wider drip tip equals more vapor. A longer one makes the vapor cooler. A shorter drip tip makes it hotter. And a narrow drip tip concentrates flavor. He also mentions that metal transfers heat more than Delrin, ceramic, or glass. Someone else also agrees with that, saying that Delrin doesn't absorb heat from the atomizer. So, and that's one really good reason for using Delrin drip tips. I have a couple of metal ones myself. For example, I have a Freak Show Mini, and it's really, really tiny. And if I use a short drip tip, a metal one, it'll burn the hell out of my lips. So I actually bought a long metal one, and that cools it down before it burns my lips. Someone else here also mentioned that he likes Pyrex tips, which aren't as popular today because they're just so fragile, but they do stay cool and they're really decorative. He also mentions that acrylic and TrueStone tips are a lot like Pyrex, but a lot more durable. And I thought there was a good point here made by someone saying that a good top cap will have the engineer's intent in the drip tip, so it shouldn't be too bad. But, you know, as we all know with vaping, we all have different preferences and things, and you might find that modifying your atomizer in ways as small as just changing a drip tip can really enhance that experience. For me personally, I like wide bore drip tips just because I like a lot of airflow, but I do notice that between all my different tanks with using different types of drip tips, wide bore does tend to lose flavor as compared to like a short, thin drip tip. I don't lose enough flavor to really bother me. To be honest though, I haven't really used a whole lot of drip tips. I mean, I just use whatever comes with the device, with the atomizer usually. And but I don't have any like custom made drip tips or anything like that, so I don't have a whole lot of experience. If I actually used something custom, or if I even paid more attention to it, my opinion of that might change. All right, now the next one I want to talk about here was another thread on e-cigarette forum, and this one was titled, "Is vaping a male-dominated activity?" There was a lot of responses here, and all of it is anecdotal. People saying things like, well, I'm a female and I vape and all my friends vape, or I'm a guy and my girlfriend vapes and she has girlfriends who vape. I think the problem with asking a question like that with just getting people's opinions or anecdotes isn't very accurate, because people tend to hang out with people like themselves, with people with similar interests. So this is a vaping forum. Everyone's vapors, and the people they hang out with are probably vapors. So not very accurate, but if I look at my Google Analytics data for my website, I can see that my audience is 80% male and 20% female. So I know at least on my website, it's mostly male dominated. And I've seen statistics like this on from other sites too. I'm fairly confident in saying that vaping is male dominated. There are definitely females out there. I mean, it's pretty obvious. We see them on social media and on these forums, but I don't really know why that is. It could be that just inherently, maybe women just aren't as interested in the hobbyist side of vaping as guys are. You know, guys, this is just opinion and maybe I'm stereotyping, but guys just tend to be into more nerdier things than women. And hobbyist vaping is kind of nerdy, so maybe that's an aspect of it. I also hear a lot of women saying things on forums or on in comment sections of YouTube that they don't feel like they're as accepted, so they just don't get into it as much. And you see that a lot in the gaming community too. Gaming is, well, at least it was for many years, for a long time, male dominated, and just in the last decade or so, women have really started coming into it. And a lot of that reason was because the male population of gamers were very disrespectful of women, and women just didn't want to come into it. So I don't see a lot of disrespect towards women in the vaping industry, but I'm not a woman, so I don't see it. But that could be one of the reasons. But yeah, I just thought it was an interesting subject to bring up. All right, and this last one I want to talk about was another thread on e-cigarette forum. This guy asks, what can I make with these e-liquids, or with these liquids? So he bought a bunch of different concentrates, and he feels like he wasted his money on them because he's made several batches, and to him they all tasted pretty terrible. So then he asked the community, what can I make? And he listed out all of the concentrates that he's purchased. So the best response I found here was this person said, "You're not alone in feeling that way. It happens frequently if someone doesn't find the few recipes they like first and then order their flavorings." And I hear about that a lot too. People just go into it buying flavors that sound good, not realizing that you actually should have a recipe. And then he mentions here that the problem with that is that making recipes often calls for a variety of flavoring types, not just main or primary flavorings. And based on this list that this guy provided, he purchased pretty much all primary flavors. And I think he makes a really good point here at the end of his post, where he says that no one really makes like really great e-liquids as soon as they start. It takes trial and error, adjusting recipes, test vaping, making small changes to the recipes, and so on. But if you use some of the tried and true methods that are already out there online, you'll eventually end up making some really good e-liquids. And I absolutely agree with that. My first couple of DIY recipes, they actually weren't too bad because I did follow a recipe, but I changed it up a little bit and used max VG, which the recipe didn't call for, and my flavors came out very, very muted. And it turns out that the concentrates that I had purchased don't tend to mix well with VG. They mix better with PG, or at least lower VG ratios. So that's something that I learned, and it's just a learning process. And I just want to add to that, if you do happen to have a bunch of concentrates that you've purchased and you don't know what to make, there's a really cool tool on e-liquid recipes. That's e-liquid-recipes.com. And if you create an account, you can log in, and under the user field, you'll see an option to choose My Flavor Stash. So if you go to My Flavor Stash, you can add all of the flavors that you have, and this keeps track of all the concentrates that you have, which is useful in itself. But something else that you can do is click this button here that says, what can I make? So this tool will automatically look at all of the ingredients that you have and find all of the recipes that people have submitted. So using those ingredients. So there's a whole list of things that you can make just based on your list. So it's a really cool tool. For example, if I look at the My Flavor Stash, which doesn't have a lot of stuff because I haven't bought in a lot of stuff, maybe, I don't know, 22 different concentrates, I can make at least 107 recipes. Now, not all of them might be good, but there are recipes here that I can make. Okay, so that's all I have for this show. You'll find the show notes for this episode 33, on VapePassion.com. If you want to support the show, consider donating to my Patreon page. You can find that at patreon.com/VapePassion. You can follow me on Twitter at VapePassion. I'm also on Facebook. For podcast listeners, you can catch the video version of this show on YouTube. And for YouTube viewers, if you don't have time to watch it on YouTube and you'd rather listen to it in your car, check out the podcast. You can find that on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. And like always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me, alex@vapepassion.com. All right, so that's going to do it. See you all next week.